The sun was setting over Copper Creek, painting the dusty main street in shades of orange and red. It was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday evening, but the whole town was buzzing with excitement. People were whispering in the general store, gathered in small groups outside the bank, and hurrying toward the Red Horse Saloon like moths drawn to a flame. Word had spread like wildfire that afternoon. 5 young ladies, all dressed in their finest traveling clothes, were sitting inside the saloon. They weren't there for drinks or entertainment. They were there because supposedly they owed money, a lot of money. And tonight, the saloon owner was going to auction them off to the highest bidders to pay their debts. The story going around town was simple enough. These 5 women had come to Copper Creek as mail-order brides. They'd traveled hundreds of miles from back east, carrying nothing but hope and small suitcases. But when they arrived, their intended husbands were nowhere to be found, gone without a trace. Now they were stuck in a strange town with no money, no family, and according to the saloon owner, they owed him for their room and board. Inside the Red Horse Saloon, the atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and tension. The 5 women sat on wooden chairs that had been arranged on the small stage where traveling musicians usually performed. They looked completely out of place among the rough miners, cattle drivers, and drifters who filled the room. The first woman was clearly a teacher. You could tell by the way she sat straight-backed and kept adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite everything happening around her, she kept trying to maintain her dignity. She'd introduced herself as Miss Johnson when she first arrived in town, and she spoke with the careful pronunciation of someone who'd spent years in front of a classroom. Next to her sat a young woman with calloused hands and a measuring tape still hanging around her neck. She was obviously skilled with needle and thread, probably a seamstress or dressmaker. Her brown dress was simple but perfectly fitted, showing off her own handiwork. She kept her eyes down, but her hands were steady. She wasn't the type to fall apart easily. The third woman had flour under her fingernails and the kind of strong arms that came from kneading bread every day. A baker's daughter, most likely. She'd been asking around town about ovens and supplies. When she first arrived, talking about the pies and cakes she wanted to make for her new husband. Now she sat quietly, but you could see anger burning in her green eyes. Then there was the one who looked like she'd spent time taking care of sick people. She had the gentle hands and quick eyes of someone used to spotting trouble before it got worse, a nurse probably. She'd been the one checking on an old man's infected cut just yesterday, working without being asked and refusing payment. Her kindness had already made her friends in town. The last woman was the youngest, maybe 20 at most. She had the soft voice and patient manner of someone raised in a church. When she'd arrived, she'd immediately asked about Sunday services and offered to help with the choir. Now she sat with her hands folded, lips moving in what looked like silent prayer. These weren't the kind of women you'd expect to see in a saloon, especially not as unwilling participants in some twisted auction. They were decent, hardworking women who'd made brave choices to travel west for new lives. Now they were trapped in a nightmare they never could have imagined. The saloon owner, a man named Blackwood, was a large fellow with greasy hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd arrived in Copper Creek about 6 months ago, with enough money to buy the Red Horse and several other properties around town. Nobody knew much about his past, and frankly, nobody wanted to ask too many questions. He had a way of making problems disappear, and not always through legal means. Tonight, Blackwood was dressed in his finest suit, acting like he was doing the town a favor. He kept telling anyone who'd listen that he was just a businessman trying to recover his losses. These women had eaten his food, slept in his rooms, and now they needed to pay up. If they couldn't pay with money, well, they'd have to find other arrangements. The crowd in the saloon was getting rowdier by the minute. Some of the men were already drunk, shouting crude suggestions about what they'd do with a wife. Others were counting their money, figuring out how much they could bid. A few looked uncomfortable with the whole situation, but not uncomfortable enough to leave or speak up. The teacher, Miss Johnson, was the only one who dared to look directly at the crowd. Her jaw was set in a way that said she wasn't going down without a fight. She'd already tried talking to the territorial marshal earlier that day, but he was out of town chasing cattle rustlers. The local sheriff was in Blackwood's pocket, bought and paid for with free drinks and who knows what else. Meanwhile, 30 miles outside of town, a man named Thomas Mackenzie was finishing up his evening chores. His ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, with good grazing land and a decent water supply. He built it up over 10 years of hard work, starting with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his father. Thomas was the kind of man who kept to himself. He was tall and broad-shouldered from years of physical labor, with sun-weathered skin and hands that were equally good at gentling a spooked horse or defending what was his. He'd been married once, to a sweet woman named Mary who died along with their infant son during a harsh winter 3 years back. Since then, he'd thrown himself into work, trying to outrun the loneliness that followed him everywhere. His only regular company was his foreman, an older man everyone called Old Pete. Pete had worked ranches his whole life and had more horse sense than most people had regular sense. He'd been with Thomas since the beginning, helping build the ranch from a dream into something real and profitable. That evening, Pete had ridden into town for supplies and news. It was their usual routine. Pete would handle the business and gossip, while Thomas stayed home with the cattle in his thoughts. Tonight, Pete came back earlier than expected, and he looked troubled. Thomas was repairing a fence post when he heard Pete's horse approaching at a faster pace than usual. The older man's face was grim as he dismounted, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Boss, we got a problem in town," Pete said, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his gray hair. "Actually, 5 problems, and they're all sitting." "In Blackwood Saloon right now?" Thomas straightened up, setting down his hammer. Pete wasn't the type to get worked up over saloon drama, so this had to be something serious. "What kind of problems?" Thomas asked. Pete told him about the 5 women, about the missing husbands, about the auction that was supposed to happen that very night. As he talked, Thomas felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was anger, but it was more than that. It was the same feeling he'd had as a boy when he'd seen older kids picking on someone smaller and weaker. "You sure about this?" Thomas asked when Pete finished talking. "Sure as sunrise," Pete replied. "Those women are in real trouble, boss. And Blackwood's got the whole thing set up, so it looks legal on paper, but it ain't right, and you know it." Thomas looked out toward the horizon where the lights of Copper Creek flickered in the distance. He'd been avoiding town lately, avoiding people in general. It was easier to deal with cattle and horses than with the complicated mezzanines of human problems. But this wasn't complicated. This was 5 innocent women being treated like property, and that was something he couldn't ignore. The truth was, Thomas had been lonely for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to care about other people. But hearing about those women sitting in that saloon, waiting to be sold off to whoever had the most money, reminded him that there were still things worth fighting for in this world. "Saddle my horse," he told Pete quietly, "and grab your rifle." "You sure about this, boss?" Pete asked, though he was already moving toward the stable. Thomas picked up his gun belt from where it hung on a fence post. He'd been hoping for a quiet evening, maybe some reading by the fire. Instead, it looked like he was going to town after all. "Some things are more important than staying out of trouble," he said, checking his pistol before sliding it into its holster. "And this is one of them." The Red Horse Saloon was packed tighter than a church on Easter Sunday. Men were pushing and shoving to get closer to the stage, and the air was thick with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and greed. Blackwood stood behind the makeshift podium he'd set up, grinning like a cat that had caught 5 mice all at once. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he called out, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "Let's keep this civilized. We're here to conduct business, not start a riot." The 5 women on the stage looked like they wanted to disappear into the floorboards. The teacher kept adjusting her glasses nervously, while the seamstress had gone completely pale. The baker's daughter was gripping her chair so hard her knuckles had turned white, and the nurse was looking around the room like she was calculating escape routes. Only the preacher's daughter seemed calm, though if you looked closely, you could see her lips moving in constant prayer, Blackwood pulled out a stack of papers from his coat pocket and waved them in the air. Now, before we begin, let me make sure everyone understands the situation. These fine ladies came to our town as mail-order brides, expecting to marry upstanding men who would take care of their needs. Unfortunately, those men have disappeared, leaving behind some significant debts. A gruff miner in the front row spat tobacco juice into a spittoon. What kind of debts we talking about, Blackwood? Room and board, transportation costs, meals, clothing allowances, Blackwood rattled off smoothly. These ladies have been living at my establishment for 2 weeks now, and somebody has to pay for their upkeep. Since their intended husbands are nowhere to be found, and these ladies have no money of their own, we need to find alternative arrangements. The teacher finally found her voice. That's not true, she called out, standing up from her chair. We never agreed to any of this. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. Miss Johnson, please sit down. We've been through this already. The contracts are quite clear. What contracts? She demanded. We never signed anything that said we could be sold off like cattle. A murmur went through the crowd. Some of the men looked uncomfortable, but others just seemed annoyed that the entertainment was being delayed. One particularly rough-looking character shouted from the back, "Just get on with it, Blackwood. We ain't got all night." But the teacher wasn't backing down. These papers you're waving around are fake. Our real agreements were with completely different men, and they specifically stated that we would be wives, not servants or property. Blackwood's face was starting to show cracks in his friendly mask. He motioned to 2 large men who'd been standing near the bar. They started moving toward the stage, and the message was clear: sit down and shut up, or we'll make you. That's when Lucy, the saloon's barmaid, made a decision that would change everything. Lucy had been working at the Red Horse for 3 years, ever since her husband died in a mining accident. She'd seen a lot of ugly things in her time there, but this was too much even for her. She'd been listening to the women's story for the past 2 weeks, bringing them meals and trying to offer what comfort she could. She knew the truth about what had really happened, and it was far worse than anyone in that room suspected. Lucy caught the teacher's eye and gave her a small nod. Then she started moving through the crowd, pretending to collect empty glasses while she whispered to certain men she knew had consciences. "This ain't right," she murmured to the blacksmith, a decent man with 3 daughters of his own. "These women are telling the truth. I've heard the whole story." She worked her way around the room, planting seeds of doubt wherever she could. "Those missing husbands didn't just disappear," she whispered to the bank clerk. "Something bad happened to them, and these ladies are being blamed for it." Meanwhile, on the stage, the tension was escalating. Blackwood's men had reached the platform and were standing behind the women like guards. The message was clear: any more outbursts would be dealt with quickly and quietly, but the seamstress, who'd been silent up until now, suddenly spoke up in a voice that carried clearly across the room. "Our husbands didn't abandon us," she said, her Spanish accent making her words even more compelling. "They were murdered." The saloon went dead quiet. Even the piano player stopped mid-song. Blackwood's face went red. "That's a serious accusation. Miss, I hope you have proof to back up such claims." "We have proof," the baker's daughter said, finding her courage. "Letters from our intended husbands that never arrived. Personal belongings that somehow ended up in your possession. And witnesses who saw our men talking to your associates the day before they disappeared." The crowd was starting to shift uncomfortably. Murder was a serious business. Even in a rough town like Copper Creek, if these women were telling the truth, then this wasn't just about unpaid debts anymore. Lucy seized the moment. She stepped forward from the crowd, her tray of empty glasses. "Forgotten." "She's right," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I've been listening to their story for 2 weeks. Those men were killed, and Mr. Blackwood here has been forging documents to make it look like these ladies owe him money." All hell broke loose. Some men started shouting for proof, others were demanding to see the supposed contracts, and a few were already backing toward the doors. Nobody wanted to be part of a murder cover-up, especially not one that involved innocent women, Blackwood was losing control of the situation fast. He signaled to more of his men, who started spreading through the crowd. These weren't just saloon workers, they were armed and dangerous, the kind of men who solved problems with violence. "Now hold on just a minute," Blackwood said, his voice booming over the chaos. "These are serious accusations being thrown around by desperate women who'll say anything to avoid paying their debts. Lucy, you're drunk and talking nonsense," but Lucy wasn't backing down. "I'm sober as a judge, and I know what I heard. These, ladies told me everything. How their men were supposed to meet them at the train station. How instead they were met by your boys who told them their husbands had been delayed. How they were brought here and told they'd have to wait, and how the waiting turned into threats and demands for payment. The teacher took over the story. We were told our husbands had left town on urgent business but would be back soon. Days went by, then weeks. When we asked to send telegrams to our families back east, we were told the telegraph lines were down. When we asked to leave town to look for our husbands ourselves, we were told we owed money for our rooms and couldn't leave until we paid. The nurse, who'd been quiet until now, pulled a small leather journal from her pocket. "I kept notes," she said simply. "Every conversation, every threat, every lie we were told. It's all written down here with dates and times." The crowd was getting more agitated by the minute. Some of the men were starting to look angry, not at the women, but at Blackwood. Others were just confused, trying to figure out what was really going on. That's when someone in the crowd shouted, "What about Miller and his boys? They were supposed to meet brides too, but nobody's seen them in weeks." Another voice called out, "And what about those 3 fellas from Kansas? They had a big meeting with Blackwood right before they disappeared." Suddenly, pieces of a bigger puzzle were starting to fall into place. Men who'd come to town looking for wives or business opportunities and then vanished without a trace. All of them had one thing in common. They'd all had dealings with Blackwood right before they disappeared. The youngest woman, the preacher's daughter, stood up slowly. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise like a knife. "We're not asking you to take our word for it," she said. "We're asking you to use your common sense. 5 women traveled hundreds of miles to marry men they'd never met. Why would we make up a story about murder? What would we gain from it?" She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. These women had nothing to gain and everything to lose by making false accusations. If they were lying and got caught, they'd face serious consequences. But if they were telling the truth, Blackwood could see the mood in the room shifting against him. He'd underestimated these women, thinking they'd be too scared or too weak to fight back. Now his carefully planned auction was turning into a disaster that could expose everything. He made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is all very interesting," he said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "but we're getting off track. These ladies owe money, and money is what we're here to collect. Everything else is just emotional storytelling designed to avoid payment." But his words fell flat. The crowd was no longer interested in an auction. They wanted answers about missing men and forged documents. They wanted to know if their town had been harboring a murderer who'd been preying on innocent people. Outside the saloon, the sound of approaching horses cut through the night air. Someone was coming, and they were coming fast. The question was, would it be help for the women or more trouble from Blackwood's associates? Inside the Red Horse, tension filled the air like smoke from a prairie fire. The 5 women stood together. On that stage, no longer looking like victims but like survivors who'd finally found their voices. The truth was out now, and there was no putting it back in the bottle. Whatever happened next, everyone in that room knew that this night would be remembered in Copper Creek for a very long time. The sound of horses thundering down the main street grew louder by the second. Inside the Red Horse Saloon, everyone froze. Blackwood's face went white as a sheet, and his hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip. His men spread out. Around the room, hands resting on their weapons, ready for whatever was coming through those doors. The 5 women on the stage looked toward the entrance with a mixture of hope and fear. They'd been fighting for their lives with nothing but words and courage, but they knew that wouldn't be enough against Blackwood's armed men. Whatever was approaching outside could either be their salvation or their doom. The hoofbeats stopped. Right outside the saloon. Heavy boots hit the wooden sidewalk with purpose, and then everything went quiet for one long, terrifying moment. Even the drunk miners stopped their mumbling. The only sound was the creaking of the old building settling, and someone's nervous breathing. Then the batwing doors exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire building. The wooden doors didn't just swing open, they splintered completely off their hinges and clattered across the floor in pieces. Standing in the doorway was the biggest man most folks in that saloon had ever seen. Thomas Mackenzie filled the entire doorframe. He was 6 feet 4 inches of pure determination, with shoulders broad enough to block out the moonlight behind him. His face was set in stone, and his eyes swept the room like a hawk looking for prey. He'd ridden hard from his ranch, and dust covered his clothes, but there was nothing tired about the way he stood there. Old Pete appeared beside him, rifle in hand and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but was too loyal to abandon his boss. Behind them, 3 more ranch hands materialized from the shadows outside, effectively blocking any escape through the main entrance. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Thomas's gaze moved slowly across the crowded room, taking in every face, every weapon, every possible threat. When his eyes finally landed on the 5 women sitting on that makeshift stage, something changed in his expression. The cold anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, a fierce protectiveness that made even Blackwood's toughest men take a step backward. "This stops now," Thomas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. There was something about the way he spoke that made you believe he meant every word, and had the power to back it up. Blackwood tried to recover his composure, putting on his fake businessman smile. "Well, well, Thomas Mackenzie, isn't it? I don't recall inviting you to this little gathering. This is private business, friend, nothing that concerns you." Thomas stepped into the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Any business that involves treating women like cattle concerns me plenty." "Now, see here," Blackwood blustered, waving his stack of papers again. "These ladies owe legitimate debts, and I'm just trying to recover my losses. Everything here is perfectly legal." "Legal?" Thomas's voice dropped even lower, which somehow made it more menacing. "Is murder legal now, Blackwood?" The word murder hit the room like a lightning bolt. Several men who'd been standing near Blackwood suddenly found reasons to move away from him. Even his own men looked uncomfortable, though they kept their hands near their guns. The teacher on the stage found her voice again. "He's right," she called out, pointing at Blackwood. "This man killed our husbands and forged papers to make us look like debtors. We're not here by choice. We're prisoners." Blackwood's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't prove anything, you lying witch," he snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "And you," he turned to Thomas, "have no authority here. This is my establishment, and I'll run it however I see fit." Thomas smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Your establishment, is it? Well, let me tell you something about authority, Blackwood. Every man in this room has the authority to stop a crime when he sees one. And what I see here is kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder." One of Blackwood's men, a skinny fellow with nervous eyes, started reaching for his gun. He never got the chance to draw it. Old Pete's rifle swung around faster than anyone would have expected from a man his age, and suddenly the barrel was pointing right at the gunman's chest. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, son," Pete said calmly. "These old eyes might not be what they used to be, but at this distance I couldn't miss if I tried." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Men were calculating distances, figuring out who was armed and who wasn't, wondering if they were about to witness a gunfight or if cooler heads would prevail. Thomas kept walking forward until he was standing right in front of Blackwood. Up close, the size difference was even more dramatic. Blackwood was a big man, but Thomas towered over him like a mountain over a hill. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, his voice steady and calm. "You're going to hand over those fake papers you've been waving around. Then you're going to tell these ladies they're free to go wherever they please. And then you're going to explain to the territorial marshal, when he gets back, exactly what happened to their husbands. Blackwood's face turned red with rage. You have no right to come into my place and make demands. I've got 10 men in here. And you've got what, 4? You're outnumbered, Mackenzie. Thomas glanced around the room casually. 10 men, you say? Let's see about that. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. Any man in this room who thinks it's right to sell women like livestock, step forward now. Any man who thinks murder and fraud are acceptable ways to do business, let's see you stand with Blackwood. Nobody moved. Not a single person stepped forward to support Blackwood. Even some of his own men were looking at the floor, suddenly very interested in their boots. The seamstress on the stage stood up slowly. I kept one of my husband's letters, she said, her voice shaking but determined. He wrote about meeting with a man named Blackwood to discuss business opportunities. That was 3 days before he disappeared. The baker's daughter pulled a small object from her pocket. This was my husband's pocket watch. His initials are carved on the back. I found it in Mr. Blackwood's office when I was looking for paper to write a letter home. The evidence was piling up, and everyone in the room could see it. What had started as a simple auction was turning into an expose of something much darker and more sinister. Blackwood was getting desperate. You're all fools, he shouted. These women are lying to save their own skins. They're criminals themselves, probably in league with whoever really killed those men. That's when the youngest woman, the preacher's daughter, spoke up. Her voice was quiet, but in the tense silence of the saloon, everyone heard every word. Mr. Blackwood, she said, if we were criminals, why would we stay in town for 2 weeks, giving you time to catch us? Why wouldn't we just run away? And if we were lying about being mail-order brides, how would we know so many details about our husbands' lives, their families, their plans? Her simple logic cut through all of Blackwood's bluster like a sharp blade. Even the drunkest miner in the room could see that her questions made perfect sense. Thomas nodded approvingly at the young woman, then turned back to Blackwood. The lady makes a good point. And here's another one for you to consider. I've got 3 more men outside, watching every exit from this building. And the territorial marshal is due back tomorrow morning. You can explain this situation to me now, or you can explain it to him with a hangman's noose around your neck. Blackwood looked around the room desperately, searching for support that wasn't there. His own men were backing away from him now, clearly not wanting to be associated with murder charges. The customers who'd come for the auction were filing toward the exits, having lost all appetite for the evening's entertainment. This isn't over, Mackenzie, Blackwood snarled. You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a lonely rancher sticking his nose where it doesn't belong? Thomas stepped even closer, and now Blackwood had to crane his neck to look up at him. You're right about one thing, Thomas said quietly. I am lonely. Lost my family a few years back, and I've been keeping to myself ever since. But you know... What? Seeing 5 innocent women in trouble reminded me that there are still things in this world worth fighting for. He reached out and plucked the stack of papers from Blackwood's hand before the man could react. Starting with making sure bullies like you don't prey on people who can't fight back. Thomas tore the forged documents in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. Ladies, he said, turning to address the women on the stage, you're free to go. And if any man in this room has a problem with that, he can take it up with me. The 5 women stood up slowly, hardly daring to believe that their nightmare might finally be over. The teacher looked directly at Thomas, and for the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, she smiled. Thank you, she said simply. We don't even know your name, but thank you. Thomas Mackenzie, ma'am. And you don't need to thank me. This is just what any decent person would do. But everyone in that room knew he was wrong about that. What Thomas Mackenzie had done took more than decency. It took courage, strength, and a willingness to risk everything for people he'd never even met. The ride out to Thomas's ranch that night was quiet, except for the sound of horses' hooves and creaking wagon wheels. The 5 women sat in the back of old Pete's supply wagon, wrapped in blankets that Lucy had quickly gathered from the saloon. None of them spoke much during the journey. They were all still processing what had happened and trying to figure out what came next. Thomas rode alongside the wagon on his horse, keeping watch for any sign of trouble. Blackwood had disappeared into the night after the confrontation along with most of his men, but Thomas wasn't taking any chances. Men like that didn't give up easily, and he knew they might try something once they'd had time to regroup and plan. The ranch house came into view, just as the first rays of dawn were painting the eastern sky pink and gold. It was a solid, comfortable-looking building with a wide front porch and smoke rising from the chimney. Behind it, they could see a large barn, several smaller outbuildings, and miles of fenced pasture land stretching to the horizon. "It's beautiful," the teacher whispered, speaking for the first time since they'd left town. The others nodded in agreement. After 2 weeks of being trapped in that stuffy saloon, the open space and fresh air felt like a gift from heaven. Thomas helped each woman down from the wagon, and they stood uncertainly in front of the house. They were grateful to be away from Blackwood, but they also realized they were now dependent on the kindness of a stranger. None of them knew what Thomas expected in return for his help, and years of experience had taught them to be cautious about trusting men too quickly. "Ladies," Thomas said, removing his hat, "I know this situation is awkward for everyone. You don't know me, and I don't know you. But what I do know is that you need a safe place to stay while we figure out what happened to your husbands and get justice for what Blackwood did to you." He gestured toward the house. "I've got plenty of room, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, will make sure you're comfortable. She's been with me for 3 years, ever since—" He paused, then continued, "Well, since I needed help running this place. She's a good woman, and she helped you settle in." The front door opened, and a plump, motherly woman in her 50s appeared. Mrs. Rodriguez had kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd obviously been waiting up for them because she was fully dressed despite the early hour. "Ay, Dios mío," she said, hurrying down the steps. "Look at these poor girls. Come inside. I have hot coffee and breakfast ready." The warmth in her voice broke down the last of the women's resistance. They followed her into the house, grateful for the promise of food and safety. The interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and colorful rugs that Mrs. Rodriguez had brought from her native Mexico. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to happen. What had started as a temporary rescue situation slowly began to feel like something more permanent and meaningful. Each of the 5 women, despite their trauma and uncertainty, began to find ways to contribute to the life of the ranch. The teacher, who'd introduced herself as Miss Catherine, discovered that several of the ranch hands couldn't read or write. Without being asked, she started holding lessons in the evenings after the work was done. She'd sit at the kitchen table with grown men who were embarrassed about their lack of education, patiently teaching them to write their own names and read simple words. Thomas would often find himself stopping his own work to listen to these lessons. There was something about Catherine's gentle patience and clear explanations that reminded him how much he'd missed having intelligent conversation. She had a way of making even the most complicated ideas seem simple and interesting. The seamstress, who went by Miss Rivera, quickly noticed that every piece of clothing on the ranch was either patched beyond recognition or falling apart entirely. She set up a workspace in the sunroom and began the enormous task of mending everything from torn work shirts to ripped saddle blankets. Her skilled hands worked magic with needle and thread, turning ragged clothes into items that looked almost new again. Old Pete was particularly grateful for her help. His arthritis made it hard for him to do fine work with his hands, and he'd been struggling to keep his clothes in decent condition. Miss Rivera not only mended his shirts but also made him a new vest that fit perfectly and looked better than anything he'd ever owned. The baker's daughter, Miss Catherine, took one look at the ranch's kitchen situation and rolled up her sleeves. The men had been surviving on beans, bacon, and whatever Mrs. Rodriguez could manage with limited supplies and equipment. Within a week, Miss Catherine had organized a proper pantry, started a vegetable garden, and was turning out bread, pies, and hearty meals that had the ranch hands. Putting on weight for the first time in years, Thomas found himself looking forward to mealtimes in a way he hadn't since his wife died. The big dining table that had sat empty for so long was now full of laughter and conversation. Miss Catherine had a gift for making even simple ingredients taste like something special, and her enthusiasm for cooking was infectious. The nurse, Miss Rebecca, quickly became indispensable around the ranch. Between the dangerous work with cattle and horses, the ranch always had its share of injuries and illnesses. She treated everything from cuts and bruises to a nasty case of pneumonia that struck one of the younger hands. Her medical knowledge and gentle bedside manner earned her the respect and gratitude of every man on the property. Thomas was particularly impressed with how she handled a crisis when his prize stallion cut his leg badly on some barbed wire. The local veterinarian was 3 days away, but Miss Rebecca cleaned and stitched the wound with the same skill and care she'd show a human patient. The horse made a full recovery, and Thomas realized how lucky they were to have someone with her training. The youngest woman, Miss Grace, brought something to the ranch that had been missing for a very long time: hope and spiritual comfort. She started holding Sunday services in the main room of the house, and gradually neighboring ranchers and their families began joining them. Her gentle sermons and beautiful singing voice created a sense of community that the isolated ranch had never had before. Thomas, who'd stopped attending church after his family died, found himself drawn to these simple services. Miss Grace had a way of talking about faith that didn't make him feel guilty for his anger and grief, but instead offered comfort and the possibility of healing. As the weeks passed, something else began to develop alongside the practical arrangements. Genuine friendships and deeper connections. Thomas found himself spending more and more time talking with Catherine about books, ideas, and dreams for the future. She was intelligent and well-educated, but she also understood the practical realities of ranch life and wasn't afraid of hard work. Old Pete, meanwhile, was clearly smitten with Miss Rivera. The gruff old cowhand would find excuses to visit her sewing room, bringing her coffee or asking if she needed anything. She seemed to enjoy his attention, and Thomas often caught them talking quietly together in Spanish, sharing stories about their families and their pasts. The ranch's doctor, a young man named Dr. Hayes, who rode out regularly to check on the workers, had started making more frequent visits ever since Miss Catherine arrived. He claimed it was because the improved nutrition was having such positive effects on everyone's health, but Thomas suspected the delicious meals and the cook's bright smile had more to do with it. Miss Rebecca had struck up a friendship with the territorial marshal when he finally returned to investigate Blackwood's crimes. Marshal Thompson was a serious, dedicated man who appreciated her intelligence and direct manner of speaking. He'd started consulting with her about the medical evidence in the case, and their professional relationship was clearly developing into something more personal. Even shy Miss Grace had found a connection with the young pastor from town, who'd started riding out to help with the Sunday services. Pastor Williams was impressed with her knowledge of Scripture and her natural ability to comfort people in times of trouble, but the biggest change was in Thomas himself. The lonely, grief-stricken man who'd isolated himself on his ranch was slowly coming back to life. Having these 5 remarkable women in his home had reminded him what it felt like to be part of a family again. The house was full of voices and laughter, purpose and hope. He still missed his first wife and son terribly, but he was beginning to understand that honoring their memory didn't mean shutting himself off from the possibility of future happiness. Catherine, in particular, had shown him that it was possible to care for someone new without betraying the love he'd had for those he'd lost. The women, too, were healing from their trauma. They'd arrived broken and afraid, but the safety and respect they'd found at the ranch was helping them remember who they really were. They were strong, capable, intelligent women who deserved to be valued for more than just their potential as wives or their ability to pay debts. As autumn approached, everyone on the ranch knew that decisions would have to be made soon. The territorial marshal's investigation was wrapping up, and the women would soon be legally free to go wherever they chose. They had options now. They could return to their families back east, Stay in Copper Creek and build new lives, or choose from the many marriage proposals they'd received from decent men who'd. The first frost of autumn painted the windows of the ranch house white when Marshall Thompson finally rode up with news that would change everything. He'd been gone for 3 weeks, following leads that stretched across 2 territories, and the serious expression on his weathered face told everyone that he'd found more than he'd bargained for. Thomas, Catherine, and the other women gathered on the front porch as the marshal dismounted. His horse looked tired from hard riding, and his clothes were dusty from long days on the trail. He removed his hat respectfully when he saw the ladies, but his eyes held the weight of difficult truths. "Ladies, Mr. Mackenzie," he said, his voice grave, "I'm afraid what we discovered about Blackwood and his operation is worse than any of us imagined." They moved inside to the warm kitchen, where Mrs. Rodriguez poured coffee for everyone. The marshal pulled out a thick folder of papers and spread them across the table. Among them were wanted posters, telegraph messages, and what looked like official court documents. "Blackwood wasn't just operating here in Copper Creek," Marshal Thompson explained. "We've connected him to similar crimes in at least 6 other towns across 3 territories. The man was running a network that specifically targeted mail order brides and their intended husbands." Miss Rivera's hand trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "How many others?" she asked quietly. "At least 20 women that we know of, probably more. And we found evidence of 15 murdered men, all of them bridegrooms who were killed for their property and savings." The marshal's voice was heavy with anger and sadness. "Your husbands weren't the first, and if we hadn't stopped this, they wouldn't have been the last." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire in the stove. The magnitude of what they'd uncovered was almost too much to comprehend. These 5 women hadn't just escaped a terrible fate, they'd helped expose a criminal enterprise that had destroyed dozens of lives. Catherine found her voice first. "What happened to Blackwood? Did you catch him?" "We did, ma'am. Caught him trying to set up the same operation in Silver Falls, about 200 miles north of here. He's in custody now, along with 5 of his men. They'll be facing charges for murder, kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy." Marshal Thompson's expression grew harder. "I can promise you this, they won't be hurting anyone else ever again." Miss Catherine wiped tears from her eyes. "And our husbands? Did you find out what really happened to them?" The marshal nodded solemnly. "We found where they're buried, about 10 miles outside of town. Blackwood's men confessed to everything. Once they realized the game was up, your husbands died trying to protect money they'd brought to start new lives with you. They were good men who deserved better." The grief that followed was deep and real, but it was also mixed with relief. For months, these women had lived with uncertainty, not knowing if their husbands had abandoned them or met with foul play. Now they finally had answers, and they could properly mourn the men who died trying to build futures with them. But Marshal Thompson wasn't finished with his news. "There's something else," he said, pulling out another set of documents. "We found something that belonged to your husbands, money they'd saved for their new lives. Property deeds, even some family heirlooms. Blackwood had kept everything, probably planning to sell it later. He handed each woman a separate envelope. 'These are yours by right. Your husbands wanted you to have these things to help you start fresh in the West. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give you real choices about your futures.'" Miss Rebecca opened her envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a bank draft, a deed to a small piece of land, and a letter written in her late husband's handwriting. The others found similar contents in their envelopes. Each man had left enough money and property to ensure his bride could survive independently if something happened to him. "They really did love us," Miss Grace whispered, clutching her letter. "Even though we'd never met, they wanted to take care of us. The discovery changed everything." These women were no longer refugees dependent on charity. They were independent. Individuals with the means to choose their own paths. They could return east to their families, buy property and start businesses, or make any other choice that suited them. Over the next few days, as the reality of their newfound freedom sank, and each woman had to decide what she really wanted from life. The conversations around the dinner table became deeper and more thoughtful as they explored possibilities they'd never dared to consider before. Catherine was the first to make her decision. She'd fallen deeply in love with Thomas, but more than that, she'd fallen in love with the life they could build together. The ranch felt like home in a way that her old life back east never had. She loved teaching the ranch hands, loved the wide open spaces, and loved the strong, gentle man who'd risked everything to save her. When she told Thomas about her decision to stay, he could barely believe it. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need you to be sure about this. Ranch life is hard, and I'm not an easy man to live with. I've got ghosts that still haunt me sometimes." She took his weathered hands in hers. "Thomas, those ghosts are part of who you are, and I love all of you, the pain and the strength that came from it. You showed me what real courage looks like, and I want to spend my life with a man who would kick down doors to save strangers." Their engagement was celebrated with a party that brought together the entire community. Neighboring ranchers, townspeople who'd grown to respect the five women, and even some of the reformed characters from that night at the Red Horse Saloon came to wish them well. Miss Rivera surprised everyone by accepting Old Pete's proposal. She discovered that underneath his gruff exterior was a man with a heart as big as the territory itself. He'd courted her with wildflowers, broken Spanish, and a devotion that reminded her that real love had nothing to do with age or appearances. "He makes me laugh every day," she told the others, "and he looks at me like I'm the most beautiful woman in the world. How could I not love a man like that?" Miss Catherine chose to marry Dr. Hayes, but not before making it clear that she intended to continue her culinary pursuits. She wanted to open a restaurant in Copper Creek that would serve real food to travelers and locals alike. Dr. Hayes not only supported her dream but offered to help finance it. "The territory needs good food as much as it needs good medicine," he told her, "and I can't think of anything better than coming home to a wife who's also the best cook in 3 counties. Miss Rebecca's choice was perhaps the most surprising. Marshall Thompson had offered her the chance to become the territory's first female deputy marshal, working specifically on cases involving crimes against women and children. The badge came with a proposal of marriage, but also with respect for her skills and independence. "I want to make sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else," she explained. "And I want to do it alongside a man who sees me as a partner, not just a wife." Miss Grace chose to marry Pastor Williams, but she also chose to establish a school for girls in Copper Creek, something the growing town desperately needed. Her late husband's inheritance was enough to buy land and build a proper schoolhouse, and her natural teaching ability would ensure that future generations of girls would have opportunities their mothers never had. The wedding preparations took months as the community came together to celebrate not just 5 marriages, but the transformation of their entire town. What had started as a rough frontier settlement was becoming a real community, anchored by families and guided by people who believed in justice and second chances. Thomas's ranch became the center of it all, the lonely house where he'd grieved alone was now the heart of a thriving network of friends and family. Sunday dinners regularly hosted 20 people or more, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the pastures as the couples started their families. Catherine proved to be everything Thomas had hoped for and more. She was his partner in every sense, helping with ranch decisions, teaching their children and the neighboring kids, and bringing joy back into his life in ways he'd thought were impossible. They named their first son after the husband she'd lost, honoring the man whose death had led to their meeting. The 5 women stayed close friends for the rest of their lives, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrations that came with building new lives in a demanding land. They'd survived the worst that frontier life could throw at them, and they'd emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Years later, when people asked about the night that changed Copper Creek forever, they'd talk about courage and justice and the power of good people standing up to evil. But the women themselves knew the real truth. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you can lead to the best things in your life, if you're brave enough to embrace the possibilities that come from starting over. The little town of Copper Creek grew and prospered, anchored by 5 families who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances. And every year on the anniversary of that terrible night at the Red Horse Saloon, they'd gather together to remember how far they'd come, and to celebrate the choices that had led them to lives they'd never dared to imagine.